Thanks for tuning into our webinar series. In case you didn't notice, my name is Pastor Darren Brake, Associate Pastor at the House of the Lord, and in case you didn't notice, it's being brought to you from a partnership between the House of the Lord and Summit County Community Partnerships. It is being funded with a grant from the Ohio Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services. In this second part of the webinar series, we will hear from Myron Lewis, a chemical dependency counselor, who will talk to us about fears and concerns which hinder recovery. Stay tuned. Good afternoon and welcome to In Case You Didn't Notice. My name is Pastor Darren Brake, Associate Pastor at the House of the Lord, and we are in part 2 of our webinar series, and this webinar series is coming out of a partnership between the House of the Lord and Summit County Community Partnerships, as well as a grant that was provided by the Ohio Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services. To begin our webinar today, we're just going to start with some words from Bishop Joey Johnson, Senior Pastor and Founder of the House of the Lord. He's going to get us started with some opening remarks and prayer, and then we'll go from there. Bishop Joey.
Thank you, Pastor Darren. It's great to be a part of a partnership where we're going to be helping people, and we're glad to have Brother Myron on today to share his powerful testimony and words and knowledge in this field. We believe that the church sits at a unique crossroads between what's happening physically, emotionally, and spiritually. And so that's the reason why we are partnering in this way, because the spiritual aspect of recovery, people are starting to recognize how important that is. So we're glad you've tuned in. You're in for a treat today. Let me pray for you. Father, we thank you for this great opportunity to be able to help people in areas where they need some help. And we haven't given as much attention to this area as we probably needed to in the past, but we're glad that it is coming to the forefront. People are beginning to recognize the issues and are beginning to address them in powerful ways. Would you bless our presenter today, give him wisdom, perspective, clarity of voice, and all that he needs to be able to impact us for health and for change and for the future. So we thank you for this opportunity. Pray it in his name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Bishop Joey. And I want to introduce to some and present to others. Our speaker for our webinar today is Myron Lewis. Myron is a chemical dependency counselor. He is a dedicated, focused, flexible, and knowledgeable social service counselor, currently pursuing a master's degree in psychology with a concentration in criminal justice. Utilize cognitive behavioral theory, narrative theory, motivational interviewing, Beck depression inventory, and anxiety scale, and perform accurate initial assessments and ongoing assessments of client progress. He is a certified licensed independent chemical dependency counselor, and he is eager to contribute natural leadership style, advanced counseling, and program development expertise, and exceptional public speaking towards optimizing the goals of progressive employer and instructor professor role. I know Myron personally, and I'm excited to have him on today. Like Bishop Joey said, we're all in for a treat to hear from Myron. So at this point, without further ado, I'm going to turn things over into the hands of Myron Lewis.
Too, I think I may have sent some older information, but I am a licensed independent counselor, and I do have my master's degree in sociology and things like that. So, I think it would be fitting for me to kind of let people know how I got into doing what I'm doing, because trust me, I never expected to be a chemical dependency counselor, and I never expected to work in the line of work that I'm in right now. When I went to college to actually be an engineer. Loved chemistry and did some things like that. But one year, the first year I stayed away from home, the coach got me a job, and I ended up working with some underprivileged 5 to 7 year old kids in the city of Atlanta at King Kennedy Center. I don't know if that center is still open. And that began, well, I don't think it began, because I think I've always loved working with people, but I think as a profession, that began my love for that, and I probably should have changed my major, but I didn't. You know, because when you go to college, what do you want to do? You want to get a degree, and you want to make as much money as you possibly can. So I stayed and worked with a couple of intern with a big accounting firm doing energy cost allocation studies, and that sounds real real technical and real cool. But basically, what it was they hired me to go into a college and go around to every electrical piece of equipment or everything that was using electricity. And okay, it says show my screen. So I don't know what all this means, so I'm just going to click on there and take off electrical information. So I ended up going into the anatomy, physiology building and those type of things. So got in there, got into working in the social service field through working with children. And then I came home. Came home and a friend of mine, I jumped around a bit, tried to get in the management trainee program and all of those things. And McDonald's has the way, all of those things. Good friend of mine says, hey man, they got a job open in juvenile court. And I said, hey, maybe, why not? Went in, filled out for the job, became an intake community worker, which was pretty much nothing more than a person who works and helps a juvenile probation officer within a beautiful lady, Juan, the judgeship, Judge Robinson at juvenile court. She made me a probation officer. And when I found that job, when I got to juvenile court, I knew this was where I wanted to be. I knew that's what I wanted to do. And drug and alcohol counselor, not even on my radar. But what got me into the field was one particular week, I had a number of young men who committed crimes. And I remember asking them the same question. What were you hours before leading up to your crime? And all of them told me we were either drinking or smoking marijuana. Well, I didn't have a lot to do or have a whole lot of knowledge about the therapeutic side or what to do on the prevention side of, using drugs and alcohol. All I know is that my parents told me not to do it. So I didn't really have a lot of knowledge. I decided that, hey, let me call some professionals, and some professionals that were very open. They brought me in, told me some things about use, prevention, and I just kept getting more and more knowledge. And one lady said, have you ever thought about being a chemical dependency counselor? And I said, sure. And back then it was a CCDC. And that meant you would actually do some chemical dependency counseling, and you would work under a counselor, and things would continue. And I became a counselor. Got the opportunity one day to go into substance abuse counseling full time, but I was still able to stay at juvenile court full time. And there's a funny story with that, but I won't get into that today. But it's led me to this, the time of being a licensed independent chemical dependency counselor. Recently retired from Summit County Public Health, the city of Akron. And now I'm here. And all of those things I just told you led to an almost 30-year career in working with various individuals from various racial, economic, socio-economic backgrounds, as you say, dealing with treatment issues. And one of the things that I think that we need to begin to talk about is how to increase treatment success. And that's something that's very difficult, because I think there are a lot of things that a lot of individuals don't talk about, or a lot of things that individuals really don't take into account sometimes when they begin to talk about treatment success as a whole, and treatment, success sometimes as it relates to African Americans, because that is a different subject and something that we need to talk about. As we all say, you can't paint everything with one brush. I remember when I went into drug and alcohol counseling, we all hear the thing, a drug is a drug is a drug. And for the most part, that is true. But I began to notice various things. I began to notice that because of people's personalities, there are some drugs that some people will never use. And some drugs, because of a person's personality, these are drugs that they will gravitate to. So I began to look at things like that. But when we specifically began to speak of treatment, there are things that we have to understand. First of all, understand that usually when a person is talking about, and this is usually, not all the time, but most of the times when a person is coming to get treatment, they're extremely vulnerable. They're extremely vulnerable. And if you can imagine going into a cold room and you don't have on adequate clothing. And sometimes to me, that's what I began to see. People would come in to me for counseling, for treatment, or to get assessed. And they're very raw. A lot of times, most of the time, you don't get people that come in that want to actually be there. And understand that any treatment professional will tell you, most of the people that you will counsel do not want to be in your office. Even though many times their addiction, their problems with drugs and alcohol has cost them almost everything. Sometimes they may not want to be in your office. So if I could begin to talk about treatment on and how to improve treatment, we have to improve the empathy, authentic empathy of many of the agencies that we work with. And I'm not just talking about the person who is providing the treatment. I'm talking about the agency as a whole. From the time that person hits the parking lot until the time that person gets into an office, fills out the appropriate paperwork, fills out insurance forms, and the like. That whole process needs to have some level of authentic empathy. And sometimes that's very difficult. I mean, I know some agencies where a person may be, and I'm not saying that you have power over that, but sometimes you get into an agency and, you just look at the parking lot and a person looks at there and says, the parking lot doesn't even look inviting. I can remember people driving past agencies and telling me, what, I drove past this place 4 or 5 times because I didn't think it didn't look like a place where they were doing treatment. And see, these are small things. These are small things, but when you begin to talk about improving treatment success, the small things are what you need to look at. What does your staff look like? Am I going to go to your treatment agency and find someone who necessarily looks like me? And in 2020, some people will say some things, maybe, that doesn't matter. But when you begin to look at agencies, and I'm going to an agency and they have very few people that look like me, sometimes some people look and say, is this a place where I really want to be? You know, is this a place where I really want to be? And the caveat, it's funny that when we begin to talk about that, when we begin to talk about African Americans are usually the only people that get asked that question. Give you an example. And this is a real example. The person called me, it happened to be an African American probation officer. So they called me to talk about a person, and I'm assuming, which was wrong on my part, I'm assuming that you're calling me, you're an African American worker, I'm an African American counselor, and that type of thing. So you must be calling me about an African American individual. That was a wrong assumption on my part, because you know you can't give information out because of confidentiality and things like that. So I began to tell him about agencies that I know that the person could go to and get great treatment, UMADOC and Minority Behavioral Health or Urban Ounce of Probation. This person stopped and said to me, I'm not going to send them here because this person is white. Now think about that for me. That same African American or African American workers would not even think twice about sending an African American individual to an agency that has little or no African American counselors. They would not think twice about doing that. But when it became, you know, when I began to talk about, you know, this individual and making recommendations, and this individual happened to be Caucasian, they stopped me in my tracks and said, no, it wouldn't work there. So what I'm saying, it's not to think about a racial thing, but it's something to think about how maybe we have been indoctrinated all of these years. You know, am I saying that a black person or a white person cannot get adequate treatment at a white agency or a black agency? No, I'm not saying that. But I'm saying that sometimes that needs to be a consideration. And it seems to be African Americans most of the time who tend to be saying, well, look, it shouldn't matter where he goes. Treatment is treatment. And these are the things, and these are the beliefs, and these are the things that have been so ingrained in us that we have to begin to take a look at if we are talking about improving treatment success. Because like I said before, that person is coming to you very raw. And we need to try to do those things to make them feel as comfortable as they possibly can. And as we begin to, and just like speak about treatment and beliefs, most people think that the opiate issue in the beginning was not really an African American issue. Even though if you look at the history, if you know the history about opiates and things like that, it's been an issue. And now I'm even hearing commercials that are saying the opiate epidemic is wreaking havoc in the black community. Now it's 2020. I have articles that I have read that have talked about how the fact that African Americans are dying from opiates was not really being covered in the news media. And Myron is an example person. And Myron believes in giving you real-time examples. You begin to hear things like, when you begin to think of treatment, and these are the beliefs that we have to begin to challenge. Well, African Americans are a little bit more difficult to deal with in treatment. Now, you may have people that will deny that and say, who's saying that? Well, trust me. I've been in it. I've heard it. And so what that does is here we have this belief, sometimes in therapeutic communities, in therapeutic situations, that, oh boy, here he comes, he's going to be a little difficult. So what happens? So it becomes very difficult to go into a treatment situation in an open mind or with an open mind. And these are things that we have to do. You have to approach treatment with a different mind. And so some specific things that I wanted to talk about that can help, and these are like a list of things that I will help you, that will help you understand. If you take these 3 points away, you'll be able, I think that you'll be able to improve success with African Americans and people of color. First of all, we have to challenge the taboos. And see, this is a strange thing about taboos. We're going right through COVID-19. People are talking about a vaccine. And I'm hearing people say, I ain't taking no vaccine. They're not going to do that to me. And these are educated people I'm talking about. And the thing that have come up all the time, you remember that Tuskegee experiment. And if you don't think that that today will have a bearing on how this vaccine or who's going to take this vaccine, you're really unaware. And the same thing happens in treatment. So what we have to do is we have to begin to challenge the taboos and the fears that we have about treatment. Now let me tell you why that is difficult. Because some of those fears and taboos that we have are well-founded. Are well-founded. Because a lot of African Americans or people of color have gone to treatment and therapy, and it has not really worked for them because some therapists may not really know or really be connected to what people are going through or have knowledge of that. They may have had a bad experience. Why do we know that's true? Because now we are beginning to talk about therapeutic, implicit bias. Implicit bias has kept so many people out of treatment. And now we're talking about dealing with that. When you begin to talk about dealing with implicit biases, you begin to deal with the belief system of an individual that they may have grown up with. So it becomes very difficult. So those taboos and those fears that we have are well-founded. But now what we have to begin to do, and I can say that since I started, or when I started the career long ago, it's gotten better. More people have gone to treatment. I can tell you myself that when I was going through difficulties after my father passed away, you couldn't pay me to go to treatment. And I'm a counselor. A friend of mine working in the counseling department said, Myron, can I come and talk to you? And she came in and I appeased her. I said, you know what, I know she's going to say something to me about going to treatment. And I listened and I said, okay, I'll tell you what. I'm going to go to treatment. I'm going to go get an assessment and go to therapy. Now I said in my head, the only way I'm going to go to therapy is if they have an appointment for me on Friday. And it's at a particular time. Now, what do we know about therapy treatments? Usually you call in to get an appointment and they set you 2 or 3 weeks out. I called in, the lady said, hey, Myron, we have, I got good news and I got bad news. I have an appointment. The bad news is the appointment is on Friday. I dropped the phone. I went into therapy. I went in to get treatment, and I can tell you it helped me get through that very difficult period of my life. So I became a proponent, helping to tell people to go to therapy. Now, I'm telling you this, and I'm a counselor. So if I have problems going to therapy, what do you think about everyone else? And I think because we have couples with therapy, and just to say the house of the Lord has a great, they are very good about therapy and encouraging people to go. You know, they have the grief counseling program there, and I have recommended people to go there. I'm telling you, I have had people that have gone to their grief counseling program and have told me, Mr. Lewis, it changed my life. Thank you. So when you have a religious community coming together that has not only knowledge of the benefits of treatment or therapy, and they have a particular program that they've done for years, this is where we have to begin to address some of those fears and taboos. Because believe it or not, Black people still believe in their pastors, and they still look to their pastors to give them advice about certain things. And having a great informed religious community is extremely important, because a lot of people we still use the word crazy. Oh yeah, you don't need no therapy, you just need prayer. But see, now some religious communities are saying, okay, prayer is important, but you need therapy too. You know, prayer can be enhanced. Therapy can be enhanced. Prayer can enhance anything. But now you have a person that they're beginning to look at to the religious community, and they're using prayer. And let's just be serious. Let's just be straight. We still have some therapeutic communities that do not believe in the validity of spirituality in treatment. I still believe that. And I'm not telling you something I heard about. I'm telling you something I know. So we have to begin to address those things. So, one, to recap, address those fears and taboos about treatment. Another thing that I think that we can do to help improve treatment success is we have to begin to address those hiring disparities we have racially. We have to begin to encourage, first we have to encourage African Americans to go into therapy, to look in careers and therapies. And we have to begin to not only hire more African American or people of color who are doing therapy, but we have to begin to have these hiring practices from the bottom to the top. Many of the agencies, that do therapy in the African American community, treatment facilities and those type of things, are not headed by people of color. And I'm not saying you just hire somebody because of their color, but sometimes you have to get qualified people of color, and sometimes you have to go out and find them. When I started at Akron Health Department, they asked me, Myron, if there's one thing that you could do in your career at Akron Health Department, what would you like to see? I told them then, I would like to have the opportunity to train another African American therapist to do what I'm doing. Well, when I finished working, there were no African American male therapists, I should say. Never really got the opportunity to work with one as an intern, even though I made that request and talked to people and gave people information to come to the agencies I work with for interns. Never got the opportunity to train one. And this is the funny thing. When I came to the health department, the gentleman that had been there before me, he had been there 25 years before I came, and he didn't get the opportunity to train anyone either. So we have to be intentional about, one, encouraging people of color to go into the therapy field. And two, we have to be intentional about providing opportunities for them when they finish. We must be able to do that. And we can't say it's an excuse. If you have to, we have to do what football and basketball colleges do. You need a nose guard, you go out and find it. You got to go to Mississippi, make an offer. You know, come on in here, stay in the city. We'll give you tax breaks. We'll do this. They do it for other things. Why can't we do it for therapy? So we have to begin to address those hiring disparities. And when an individual gets into these positions, you have to give them opportunities to advance. You have to give them opportunities. So those are two things, you know, the disparities. And one of the last things I would have to say, we have to begin to create authentic, honest, therapeutic alliances with all of those, and trauma sensitive alliance with all of those agencies that will be working with an individual to help their success. So what does that mean? You may have to bring in a family member. Look at what the community that person is in. Sometimes many of our clients come in and their therapeutic communities are fragmented. But we have to begin to help them piece them back together. And I think sometimes, often, spiritual leaders and spiritual individuals should be involved in that therapeutic process. You know, because the more people we can bring in, the more people we can make, I would say, familiar with the therapeutic process, the easier it will become. And then we will be able to look at a generation and can say, okay, yeah, the Tuskegee experiment happened those years ago. And yeah, I do come in with a little bit of apprehension, but I know Uncle David, he had a therapist. Aunt Susie had a therapist, and my brother Jimmy had a good therapist. So this is something that I can look at. So then, as therapy begins to become more familiar, and these therapeutic alliances begin to happen. And when I say trauma, you have to begin to understand that sometimes the trauma for me may not mean the same thing. I remember being in a conference and the lady put up on the board the definition for trauma and what a person had been going through and all these type of things. And I looked at many of them and said, wow, man, you know, as a Black man, I'm living that every day. Every day, someone's discounting me. You know, just take, for example, if you would really want to know about trauma, talk to most African American men about situations with the police. I can go back generations and talk to my great grandfather, and he can give me the same fear about police that my father gave to me, that I can give to my nephews and my little cousins. That's something that we have to begin to deal with. And I'm not saying that to make a thing about brutality, but you have to begin to understand with trauma, there's a diversity in trauma. Trauma is not the same for everyone. And you have to begin to be sensitive about that. So, I mean, I know I've been talking for a while. I know we started at 12, but you know, I can go on and on and on, but I didn't know if am I supposed to open it up at this time for questions, or do you want me to continue?
Hey, Myron. Yeah, we can open up for questions. This was you gave a lot of good information, a lot of things to think about. I know for me personally, one thing that jumped out was when you had mentioned about the biases that
Yes.
people are experiencing. Can you talk a little bit more about that a little bit? Because it just you would to me that's something that would be surprising um, to encounter that in that type of environment. Is that
Well,
something that kind of goes back to even to like needs to be addressed when someone's in college going for that type of degree, or how do you think is a good way to start addressing that?
think about this, and I'm just going to use this as a bias. African Americans talk about Jim Crow, slavery, all of that stuff, and I've heard people say, "Well, that happened long ago, and you should get over it." Okay. Now, when I talk about bias, and understand what I'm saying, you would never, you would never say that to a Jewish person. You would never tell them to just get over the Holocaust. And if you go to the Holocaust Museum, just the reverence that you feel when you walk in that place. But I had friends of mine that would ask me, why do African Americans, when they looked at the Museum of African American History in DC, that would ask me, why do you guys need a museum? And so when I begin to talk about biases, there are a lot of biases that think that people have that feel that things that African Americans go through, maybe you should not think about things like that all the time. That happened then. Why are you thinking about that now? I mean, when we look at biases, they're having seminars and all types of things that's happening in the medical field that because of racial biases, certain women were being given operations and those type of things. And I think the same thing happens in treatment.
Mm.
You look at and the biases that I'm talking about, and bias kind of comes into conversation. When you begin to hear conversations, and this is from being um, a young African American male in the probation field, and when I would hear people talk about certain kids, okay, you watch an African American kid come in committing the same crime that a white child may commit. And the African American child is looked at, well, what would you expect? That thought, what do you expect? They came from here or they came from there. Or a white child, when the thought about them committing that crime, oh, it's such a tragedy. So the expectation level becomes
Mm.
different. And these are the biases that we see, and bias feeds into your level of expectation. And I use a thing I once heard from an instructor who told me, a martial arts instructor who told me, if you don't think that your student can be just as great or greater than you can't teach them. I
Mm.
learned from an instructor in college who talked to me about, you have in the South, he said, growing up, you had two types of teachers. That one teacher who thought you couldn't learn anything because you were black and he was a racist. And that one teacher that thought you couldn't learn anything because you were black and they felt sorry for you. He said the same thing happened. The student didn't get taught. And sometimes I have seen that attitude in treatment. Like I talked before about the bias of African Americans are just more difficult to deal with in treatment. That's something that happens, something that I heard over and over. Sometimes it will surprise me hearing people say that to me.
Yeah, and it's almost like how can you really adequately help someone when you're viewing them as a problem?
And see, people are going to look at you and say, "Oh, that never happened. We would never do that," because to admit to something like that is embarrassing.
Mm-hmm.
The first thing we tell addicts is you got to be honest with yourself. If we're going to change these biases, we have to be honest and admit that they exist. And I'm trying to figure out how to wear my finger. I'm not trying to point the finger at anybody, but we have to be honest. And I think as African Americans who go to treatment, all we want is that honesty. Because we're coming to you for help. That's
Absolutely.
hard.
That's awesome. You said something else that I thought was powerful. Is you talked about the importance of prayer and therapy,
Oh,
um,
absolutely.
working together. Um, in your experience, what have been some things that maybe you've been able to do that other people could maybe learn from on how to bring that into that
Okay.
counseling relationship?
Well, the one thing that you have to do as a counselor is you have to be honest. You have to be honest. And sometimes you'll deal with an agency that's not going to let you do that. I know a lady who was counseling, and she was reprimanded because she prayed with the client at the client's request.
Oh,
And I
wow.
tell people this all the time. One thing I'm not going to do. Now, you're not going to come into my office when I was a counselor in that office. I wasn't going to, how you do the incense thing and start incensing you. And when you sit down, you put oil on your head and any of that stuff like that. You're not going to do that. But if you ask me the question, Myron, how do you get through difficult times in your life? I'm not going to lie to you.
Mm-hmm.
I may pull out a script because you asked me the question. Yes, I'm not going to proselytize to you. I'm not going to have you come in there and say, in order for me to work with you, I have to, you got to read 10 scriptures and I want you to remember these scriptures and things like that. But if a client specifically asks me, do you pray, Mr. Lewis? And they have asked me that. And I have told them, yes, I pray all the time. And any
Absolutely.
agency that I've worked for, I don't care. I'm not there to lie to anybody. So bringing prayer in is one, you have to be honest. You have to be honest. And I'm gonna tell you too, with prayer, you have to know a little bit about prayer. You have to be realistic because when people are coming into you, they're coming into you for help. So you don't want to tell a person, look, man, you get to praying, you get your prayer life together. This addiction is going to be this, that, and the other. But it's amazing to me that we tell people to go to 12 step,
Mm-hmm.
and they have to turn their life over to their higher power or God as they understand it. Now, what sense does that make if you're telling me to send that person to 12 step and I can't really talk to that person about me? I heard Father Martin said once, great tape, a great proponent of 12 step and treatment. He says, I can't see myself telling a person to just make up a higher power when I know what God has done for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I think being honest and having the opportunity to tell people these things and to let people know how you got where you are is one way to bring that type of spirituality in treatment. But are you going to come into my office and see a crucifix behind my desk and you come in and as soon as you open the door you hear, oh, happy day? No, it's not going to do that. But how I got there, yes, that's something that if you wanted to discuss with me, I'm going to be honest.
Good. We have some questions coming in here. One is, can you talk about MAT, M-A-T, and the minority community?
Medically assisted treatment.
Mm-hmm.
There needs to be greater education done and consistent education done with medically assisted treatment. That's one of those things that is a little bit taboo in the African American community. Now, I should say African American community in smaller cities, like for example, when you go to Cleveland and Chicago and places like that, it may be a little bit more prevalent. But we also have to talk to African American communities and let them know about the advances that have been made in medically assisted treatment. And we have to campaign that. It can't be something that you do this big thing and you do it once and that's it. We want to see those individuals who really went through it, you know, who experienced medically assisted treatment and it changed their life. Yeah, I've seen a few commercials that have had African Americans in it that say, yeah, medically assisted treatment helped me. But when you look at the campaign and push, like for example, literature that I got at the agency that I worked at had no African Americans on the literature. Okay, so the pharmaceutical companies, when they pass out pamphlets and things like that, they do all of these studies and say, well, look, this is the demographic that we're working with. You know, if you want to know about certain things, we need to begin to have a blitz of information. We need to be very pointed in saying, this is medical assisted treatment. This is what it is. This is what you can expect. Now, because of COVID, I've been out of things for a while, so there may have been some changes made. But I can tell you that before I retired, I couldn't go in my agency or any agency and find specific literature about medically assisted treatment targeted at African Americans. And we still have to deal with those taboos and those type of things, because most people think that when you're talking about medically assisted treatment, you're talking about methadone and Suboxone. So we have to begin to dispel some of those misconceptions that African Americans may have about treatment. And one of the only ways that you're going to do that is, like I say, to bring, find someone who's African American. And I'm going to say this: if you can't find them, then you got to ask yourself why. This day and time, you can't find no African Americans that have been successful in an MAT program. I can tell you that assessing in MAT, I assess very few African Americans.
Wow.
Very few.
That's good. That's good. We have another question here that kind of talks about when you're dealing with the challenging or the fears, it sounds like, of the taboos. What are some steps that can be taken to kind of help change a person's perspective, or to use a biblical reference, the be renewed by the transforming of your mind? Like, how do you kind of relate that to dealing with those fears and taboos?
One, you got to be honest. And two, you have to address, you can't discount that person's feeling. If I come to you with a misconception, first of all, a lot of times you don't really know what my experience is. You can still meet some older people or meet people that can tell you, yeah, I knew somebody, or an uncle or a grandfather that went through this type of thing. So what we have to do is we have to, one, speak a lot of this stuff in love, addressing those misconceptions. A lot of your things have to be factual. If a person comes to you and says, look, you don't want me, you're telling me about this, but I don't see anybody over there that looks like me. I can't find anyone that has been through that experience. Myself as a treatment professional, it's my job to say, yes, let's go explore that together. Come alongside them as they use in a motivational interview. Let's come alongside. I always like to use this example. At Home Depot, when I worked there in college, if a person came to you and said, hey, I need some plumbing clips, and you said, well, I don't know what plumbing clips are, we're going to find them together.
Mm-hmm.
In that short period of time that it took for you to take that person and say, look, I don't particularly know where that is, we're going to find it together. I'm not going to, so what I'm saying is, if a person comes to me and says, I got misconceptions, I'm going to sit down and say, bro, I got misconceptions too. But let's really take a look at this.
Yeah.
We have realistic fears that can't be discounted.
Yep.
And like you say, renewing of the mind, you know, if we look at Christ, Christ always came on the side of people. You know, one thing I learned in counseling is that if you don't have a heart for the downtrodden and the discarded and the wounded, you can't do this job effectively.
Yep.
You can't do
Absolutely.
it. And that's one thing that needs to be checked. If you don't have a heart for the downtrodden, you can't do this job. And so I think realistically coming alongside a person, admitting that, yeah, I may not know everything, but that information we can find together. Let's do that. That can help, because now you're giving support. And in the process, you may learn something too. So you're not leaving that person alone. You're coming alongside of them and you're assisting them in that process of renewal.
And so that's the last question. The other one I just wanted to give you is more of a statement that somebody put in, that they just wanted to give you a shout out in the question for always speaking the truth and staying true to yourself, and how a treasure was lost when you retired. So I want to lead in with that word of encouragement that was actually in the questions for you. So thank you again for your time and giving this wisdom and knowledge to us. And in closing, and the next In Case You Didn't Notice webinar will be held next Friday, September 18th, from 12 p.m. to 1 p.m. And on that day, we will have Jackie Pollard from Summit County Public Health and Amy Wade from the County of Summit ADM Board. And the topic they will be discussing is You Are Not Alone. Registration details will be emailed to all the participants on today's webinar. And to the participants, we just want to thank you for also taking time of your day to join us for this installment of In Case You Didn't Notice. Take care, everybody, and
thank you for thinking enough of me to have me on.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And have a good weekend, everybody. Take care.
Bye. See you later.